So let's say you're in a SolidWorks part and you want to add some stylized text in order to put that into your part to make it part of the part. And to be able to do this with sketch geometry would take a considerable amount of time, and there is an easier way of doing this. But some of the applications for something like this would be like creating a logo for your drawing, which some of you are probably going to be doing. Another application for this is you might want to dress up your part a little bit and put some stylish text in there in order to enhance the marketing appeal of that part. Another way of doing that is actually creating a an emboss on your part, or maybe a deboss, something that would be like extruded and extruded cut, to incorporate some text that might be associated with that part, like maybe a part number. You might want to put that like maybe on a foundry item or something that might be part of a plastic injection molded part. So there's a lot of applications here, but it's not typically part of the Sketch tab on the Command Manager. What you do have in here is something that's, the symbol looks the same. This is the one we're actually looking for. It's a very simply called text. But the one I'd like to demonstrate now, the one that's probably on your your Sketch tab in the Command Manager, is called Note. So let's go ahead and talk about Note real quick and see how that is actually set up for us. Okay, so let's take a look at the Note tool up here on the Sketch tab in the Command Manager and see what that does. One thing to keep in mind about the Note tool is it gives you the capacity to actually add a note that would be ultimately intended for a drawing. There are other applications for this too, but one of the primary applications over here is for a drawing. And when you put a note in here, it's going to be kind of like adding a note in SolidWorks, where you point to something with an arrow with a leader, and then you add some text next to that. It's very similar to what might expect with like a diameter or radius dimension, with a value that would be derived from that when you click on that and use that function as like a smart dimension. So very simply, if you just click on Note, and let's go ahead and choose this face over here and maybe drag that up, and we're going to call this, make this a rectangle, and see what happens. So once you put that note in there, it gives you the capacity to continue to label other things in here, and to get out of that, just do escape. So you also notice that I have my annotations folder over here opened in our feature manager, and we really haven't talked a whole lot about that, but every annotation that we have in our part so far is going to be in a couple different folders. We have some that are associated with the front plane. So those are the dimensions that we have in here for that rectangle that was defined in the sketch. Now we have one for the top, and that's going to be the thickness of that rectangle too, so that's 1/10 of an inch. So those are in there, and then we have unassigned items over here, which is going to be our note. At least it was. Let's go ahead and double click on that and see what we have in here. So because I put that note and it was associated with the front plane when I sketched those elements out, it's now part of the front annotation view. And it's got some other things in here too, called object, something I was playing around with a little bit earlier. So we could actually take that, and when you're in that annotation view, you'd actually take these annotations and delete them. So I don't think we can actually delete these without harm, so I don't think it's going to let us do that. But the annotations we just added, we can. So we can take that and make this a rectangle, click on that, and actually delete that. So the reason I'm showing you that is, if you were to have something like this, if that were part of the unassigned items up here, and you want to move that to the front annotation folder, you could do that. We could take that annotation over here, right click on that, and if you're actually following me, you can go ahead and select a different annotation view, and maybe put that in the top view, and it takes it out of that selection. If we go ahead and rebuild that, go back down to assign items, and we have it there. If we go back to the top view, then you have it there. So it doesn't really quite fit in the top view, but again, right click on that, go to select annotation view, we're going to go back to the front, and it makes that disappear. So double click on unassigned items just to make sure that we don't have these annotations showing as we go through the rest of this video. Okay, so now that we have the note out of the way, let's go ahead and play around with text. Ornamental text, perhaps, if you want to call it that. And you may not have this on your Command Manager, so how do you find it? And let me show you how to do that. So you want to make sure you're under the Sketch tab up here. If you right click over here in your Command Manager where there isn't anything, you want to make sure you don't pick any of these items if you don't have room up there. But you want to go to Customize, and from Customize you get this dialog box. What you're looking for is Commands. Where you're going to find that that annotation for a note, you're going to find that in here, which is there, and it's not necessarily going to be part of Sketch. You're not going to see text up here under the annotation folder, but if you go down here to Sketch, you should see it in here. So again, you're going to see something that looks like an A, the letter A, and it's kind of a stylish A in a way. What you want to do is take that and just drag that up to your folder, put in a location of your choosing. And if you already have something up there and you want to get rid of it, just drag it off that, drag it off the toolbar up there, drag it off the command manager, and it should work for you there too. But select it, drag it, put it where you want, and then go to OK, and it should be up there. So now that it's there in our toolbar and our command manager, let's go ahead and have a little bit of fun with it. So if you go ahead and click on that, it's going to go ahead and initiate the sketch command over here. So it's asking for a surface like it typically does. We're going to go ahead and choose that front surface of that rectangular object that I created. And starting from the top down to the bottom, we have a lot of options. You'll notice that a lot of the options down here are associated with the text itself. We have no text in here, even though the cursor is flashing over here is actually looking for some sort of selection out here in a modeling area in order to define that a little bit better. But we can ignore that right now. If you just type in the word, we're going to use the word chiller because it's kind of a fun, stylish text font option that we can put together, that we can actually choose. And you'll notice that when you type that in here, it actually comes out here in an arbitrary location in our modeling area, in our graphics area. So we're not going to go ahead and choose any of these options, but if you just go to the check mark over here, you're going to see it over here. So now we're still within the sketch environment over here, and we could take that chiller and actually move that around. So if you take that point that is over there in the lower left hand corner of chiller and move that, the text actually moves with it. So that might be convenient. That's kind of one way to control it. So arbitrarily, when you initiate this, it's going to be close to where your cursor was last time when you selected on that surface, I believe is where that starts, or it's going to be there in an arbitrary location. Then you can actually put those letters in here. If you take a kind of a closer look at that, you'll notice, like you would expect with typical sketch options in here, you need to have enclosed geometry in order for it to do something 3D. So let's go ahead and do a feature on that. And this is going to be quick and easy on this. Then I'm going to show you different ways and different options that we can select here in later segments of this video in order to better define this and better control it too. So you notice that if we did an extrude boss base and we actually look at it, we can see the preview of that, of what we're going to get. If you go to the green check mark, if you like it, there you go. There you have your chiller in the background. Of course, we could do the same thing if we went ahead and debossed that and actually made a cut out of that. Again, we can just go ahead and select that, go to extrude to cut, and it'll do the same thing here. And since it's going through the whole body, we probably want to select all the bodies here. And one thing to note here too is you can actually put a draft on it too. So again, if we were to take that sketch, go to extrude to boss base, and we can put a draft angle on that, maybe 1 degree, see what that looks like. It's going to kind of come up to a point, not quite to a point, but it's going to be a little bit thinner on top than it would be on the bottom. So again, kind of like in a simple sketch environment, you have enclosed geometry in here. If you want to do nothing more than what we have in here so far with that text, if you don't want to take it any further than this and just go ahead and use the default values and do a quick and easy rendering of that text in here, that's what you could do. You could do an extrude to boss base or extrude to cut, and with a draft angle too, and that puts that together. So in subsequent sections, we're going to talk a little bit more about control and some other options that might be associated with this in order to get something you may perhaps really want. Okay, so now that we have our text in place, it's probably not what we like. Let's go and look at some options here and see what we could do. I might perhaps making this a little bit bigger, making it a little bit more stylish, and then we can move from there. So let's actually talk a little bit about what our features are here and how it's handled. First of all, we're going to go ahead and rename that. That one's going to be called base, and this one we're just going to call our text 1. So we're going to actually put in a couple different text items in here to show you how that works. So as you can imagine, sketch number 1, which drives our base feature, that's fully defined. with those dimensions, and then the feature itself is fully defined, obviously, by the extrude that we have there. But our text 1 over here is not fully defined. If we were to right-click in that sketch, the only element in here is the text that we have in here for that sketch. And as you know, we can move this little point around and maybe plant that point on some reference geometry, and that might fully define it. In other words, you can put it down here in that corner and pick up that coincident relationship down here and put text down there. If we were to rebuild that, it says it's fully defined, which means if we go in here and try to move stuff around, it's not going to allow us to do that. So that's one way to get it fully defined. You can find reference geometry in there and define it that way. And again, we can go back in that sketch and get rid of that coincident relationship that we have down here, move that point over here in the middle of that, and then rebuild that. Now it's going to be not fully defined. So when you fully define something, that implies that it cannot be moved. And that actually works pretty well for the text that we see here. So let's see if we can define this a little bit better. Let's go in here, because we don't necessarily want that text in the corner in here, but let's go in here and edit that sketch. And of course we can move that point around and text moves with it. But what if we were to try to define this a little bit better with some additional geometry? Now let's go ahead and build a rectangle. And I'm going to do this by lines first, just to show you that there is a difference in how you lay your lines out. So we're going to build a rectangle. We're going to start from this point over here and sketch that out to the right. Then we're going to go up, and we're going to go over here, and then we're going to go down. And we're going to define this a little bit better. We're going to go ahead and make that vertical. We didn't make that vertical before. That's going to be horizontal, and this is going to be vertical too. And we're going to define this a little bit better too. But we're going to take that point, kind of move that into the side over here, on the inside of that. And if we go to green check mark for point in here, conceivably, with our feature that we have in here, if we rebuild this, it's going to have a little bit of a conflict. It doesn't know whether we should use this text in regard to what it's going to do in regard to its feature, which is going to be an extrude, or the region over here, which is going to contain that rectangle. So if we rebuild this, we're going to get that error. And we're to right click in that feature, we should be able to go down here into selected contours and be able to select that text. And we can't. So that's kind of a limitation here. We can select on the inside of that rectangle or the contour that defines that rectangle, but we cannot select that text. So it's not going to let us do that. So it implies that when we have this text in here as a sketch element in here, we can't have any model lines or model arcs in here that would normally define a 3D feature. We have to deal with that text all by itself. So let's go ahead and exit out of that. We'll keep that in error. Let's go back into that sketch. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and reapply this. We want to put a different definition on these lines. If we were to right click on that line, go ahead and select chain. What we want to do is we want to make it all back for construction. We're going to make those center lines again. And if we rebuild this, bang, we get our chiller back again. Okay, some more options. Let's right click on our sketch 2 over here. And let's go ahead and take a look at the reference geometry we put in here. And again, we could double click on this text in here and define that a little bit better. We're going to keep this undefined. I'm going to show you some options with that. So if you double click on that text, try to select that text, it's going to take us into that sketch text dialog box over here in our properties manager. And now we can actually select a curve. It could be a curve, it could be a line, it has to be construction geometry. And if you remember how we sketched these out, we started with this point over here and sketched a line out over here to the right. That was our first point. And then a little bit opposite up here, we started over here and sketched that line out. So in regard to curves, if we were to select this one, it's going to take Mr. Chiller over here and actually plant it on that line starting here. It's not, you can't change that. You just have to think about the order that you put that line in. So if you go ahead and click on that, bang, it starts here, and it's going to put that on the bottom of that line. If we're to select on this line for that curve, let's go ahead and take out that first selection. It's going to start here and put that name, Chiller, on that line starting at that point. So up here it's going to be upside down. And if we were to select that a second time, and up here it's going to put it upside down. So right here it's going to be the correct orientation that we want, and up here it's going to be on the top, it's going to be upside down. It all depends how you sketch that line out. So we can actually reverse that a little bit. We can put that on the top put it on the bottom if we want to do that by taking these options in here, but it's still backwards. So you're going to have to consider that. Again, we're going to go ahead and select this and go ahead and go back over here and put that on the right line. And we can make that upside down or right side up. A couple of different options here, but the basis of that demonstration here is to show you that no matter what lines you select here, you have to think about how that line was sketched, and it's going to go ahead and put that text on that line in regard to how you put that, how you sketch that line and which point went in there first. So we're going to go ahead and choose this bottom line over here, and if you go to the green check mark over here, which takes it out of that sketch text dialog box, now you notice that we have that line in there. We also have that point, so conceivably we can move that point around, and the text used to be able to follow that, but it doesn't anymore. It still wants to stay down here, so even though that point's still kind of kicking around out here, it has no more influence over that text. Kind of an odd way of doing it. It looks like it's underdefined if we did that, but it's still kicking out here. And if we were to go back into that text again and take that line out, now it's going to go right back to that point. Okay, so we have this thing sitting here. We have our base in here fully defined. Our sketch number 2, driving the text over here, is not fully defined. Let's see what we could do about fully defining this. We saw that if we took that point and put it down in the corner, it kind of implies that there's a concentric relationship down there, and it makes that fully defined because its orientation is not going to change. And we could do something similar by selecting some of these lines in here in order to provide that curve to define that a little bit better. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So let's take a center line from this item over here, the midpoint of that line, that edge over there, to the edge on the other side, and then a vertical one over here. See if we can find that midpoint, sketch that down, and we're going to define this so we can only define it with 2 dimensions. If we select midpoint of that and that line, we're going to make that coincident. Right click in this, select midpoint in that line, that vertical line, we're going to make that coincident. And now we're going to put some dimensions on here. So this way we know that the reference geometry that we're using is going to be fully defined, which means if we define the curve that that text is sitting on, if we make relationships of this fully defined geometry, that too should be fully defined. So let's take a look at this. If we took that point, we're still in the sketch, but we're not in the text portion of that sketch. If we were to take that and move that down to the corner, you'll notice you get a preview of a concentric relationship. The problem with that is that SolidWorks is going to imply that it's going to make that relationship, but it never does. And it never really shows us that, and it actually plants it in that point over there, and it keeps it there. We can't take those relationships and get out of there and let that be less fully defined. But one thing we could do is we could take that point and put that on that line and make that coincident, then do the same thing over here. So I think what it's trying to do is concurrently try to keep it loose, but yet it fully defines it. But once it's like fully defined, you can't really change that. The better thing to do here is to double click on that text, and let's go ahead and get into that text properties manager over here and define a curve. Let's go ahead and define this curve here. And what that does is it plants that text over here at the beginning of that line over here, and that's kind of what we want. We want to be able to fill in that rectangle if we can. If we go to the green check mark for that text, it still says it's not fully defined. We can take this point, move that around. That's not defined either. So if we go ahead and rebuild that, it's still not fully defined. So the way to fully define that is probably to take this point in here and put that in the same location too. So this kind of dominates. That curve up here is going to dominate how that text is going to be positioned. So we're going to take that point, and we're going to take this line, we're going to make that coincident to avoid that concentric relationship. This point and that line, we're going to make that coincident too. So now we have that. We have 2 coincident relationships that we can manage. If we had to delete that later, we can do that. And now we have that text almost fully defined. So if we go to the green check mark, go ahead and rebuild, now it becomes fully defined. So in the next section, we're going to go ahead and make modifications to our text to kind of approach what we would think that text should look like. Okay, so now that we have this fully defined, let's go ahead and try to get something that we really want. So if we take a look at our sketch in here, what we want to do, one of our goals here, is try to get this with a font type and style and size so it fits inside this sketch rectangle that we have in here. So let's go back to our sketch number 2. Let's go ahead and edit that sketch and then double click on the text itself. And let's go through some additional options that are available here. So again, starting from the top to the bottom, we have our curve defined, which is going to be that line number 1. We have our text called Chiller. We're going to try to choose the Chiller font. And then if we go over here, again, starting from the top down, this option over here is to be able to link it to property. And we can go to document property in here and maybe link it to it. And there's a couple different options in here. A worthy option here, if this was going to be a molded part, is to choose a bill of material part number on it and actually emboss or deboss that onto the part itself, whether it's a cast or a mold. That's one option here. But let's go ahead and get out of that. There's other options in there too. And then just regular text options in here. We can make it bold, makes it a little bit thicker. We can make it italic, and we could actually rotate the letters in here. So right now it's got a rotate of 30. It adds extra characters up here, some coding up here. We can maybe make that 45. Oop, got to make sure you leave that code in place. But if you don't like the code in there, you just go ahead and eliminate that and take that out of there. So there's other options in here too in regard to the text. We can make it left justified, center justified, right justified, or we can make it actually justified from both of them and actually spreads the letters out. But for now, let's go ahead and choose center justified. We're going to start from center and maybe build it up so it kind of fills up that rectangle that we have. And down here we could do some other options. We could flip it vertical, flip it vertical that way, or you can flip it horizontally too if you want to do that. And of course, because there's lettering in here, it's going to make that backwards. But actually, that might have an application if one of these, if what we're creating is going to be a mold, you probably want to have it pop out of the mold backwards too. So there's those options in here too. So these options down here in regard to making the letters bigger or smaller or making the space in between the letters is not available unless we go down here and check or uncheck using document font. So right now our document font is going to be Century Gothic at about 12 points. And we might want to choose something different. So here's something fun. It's called Chiller. We're going to go to Chiller. Our font style, we can make it regular, oblique, bold, or bold, oblique. And we can cover those with a simpler text or font in here. It might be able to do that for us. But if we go to regular, we're going to keep regular here. And instead of units, defining it by unit size, let's go to points. I think points are a little bit easier. And let's go ahead and choose something that's kind of big. Let's choose maybe 48, so let's see what that does. And if you go to OK, now we have Chiller. So that looks like a cool font, but one thing it's not giving us is a preview of this. And one thing I noticed with this font, even though it looks cool, there are some things that are wrong with that font. Remember, we want to be able to have enclosed geometry. We don't want to have intersection geometry like what you might find here in the top part of the E. And we have this, like, I don't know, a cookie or something like that sitting out here in the tail of the E and over here in the dot on the I. I don't think it's going to resolve itself. So if we go to the green check mark and try to rebuild that, yeah, so it's not going to do it for us. So if we exit that and right click on this and see what's wrong with it, let's go ahead and rebuild that, or not rebuild it. Let's go ahead and go in here into this text box in here, see what's wrong. It says that the sketch has intersecting contours. So we knew that was kind of a problem in there. So let's go back, and I guess the lesson to take away from this is you got to be careful of the font that you choose. And sometimes fonts are going to be problematic if they have situations like this. So let's go into that text portion of our sketch. And let's go ahead and change the font now. Let's go from Chiller. Let's change that font to Colonna, maybe, and see what that does. That too is kind of fancy, but I think we probably do not have intersecting contours in here. And instead of calling that Chiller, let's go ahead and call that Colonna. And if we go to the green check mark and go to rebuild, hopefully it's going to give it to us. Yeah, there we go. So let's go ahead and stretch this out. Let's go ahead and choose a font size that's going to fill that out. And if we go back to our sketch 2, we got our sketch element in here. And let's go ahead and change our font size to something that's really big. 72 might do it. If we go to the green check mark, that's not going to do it. So let's go back to font, and we could actually type in a value in here. And I think 100 gets really close. Exceeds it a little bit on the right hand side. But let's go ahead and go to the green check mark and see what that does. And go to the rebuild. And there we have it. So it's a little bit off to the side. We might want to do some offsets on that. And we're going to cover that here in just a moment. Okay, one last thing we might want to do is maybe straighten this out so it's a little bit more centered in our rectangle. Let's go ahead and open this up a little bit. Let's go to our sketch number 2 and open that up. Let's go ahead and double click on our sketch and see some options that we might be able to use in order to define this a little bit better. So, remember we have that center justified, and what it's doing is it's start from the center and spinning letters on the left and the right hand side in order to get that in there, but for some reason that A down here is kind of sticking out. We can play around with some of the settings in here. We can make it left justified, which kind of gives us the same thing. We can do right justified, and you'll notice it kind of cuts off that C over here. It's not really giving that to us. And if you were to make this text box a little bit bigger, instead of a 1-inch offset, maybe 1 1/4, it'll probably come back if we did that. So it's one thing to consider if your space that you're allocating for those letters don't quite fit in that space, so it'll cut them off and won't show you. Then we could just plain justify it between both ends. It still kind of sticks out over here, but that's probably a better choice. And again, we might be able to go ahead and change some of the dimensions on a rectangle here. Maybe keep that 1-inch dimension, but take out the midpoint relationship up here and be able to define it over here with a smaller dimension besides 1 inch. That could do that, but that kind of shows you your different options that you could use in order to put the final design touches on this. So, the takeaway from all this is you get to use sketch text, and that provides stylish or functional text that can be used to emboss or deboss that feature onto your part.